Good day, everyone. Welcome to this video lecture. This video lecture is intended for my Education 501 Methods of Research class in the Graduate School of Eastern Science State University. And the recording of this video lecture will be uploaded to Moodle for my blended modality class. But since I can hardly upload the video directly to Moodle because of the size. So I have to upload this to YouTube first and then copy the link to Moodle. And so my point is there might be some students or some scholars listening to this who are not under me in the Graduate School of Eastern Science State University. So welcome everyone. And the topic of this video lecture is about the proper way of writing the literature review, specifically for thesis and dissertations in the graduate school. So we know already that there are several types of lit review, like scoping review, lit review, like narrative lit review, critical literature review, and things like that. There's also the idea of reviewing several literatures or a lot of literature specific fields and employ a meta-analysis at the end of the day, and then publish the research paper based on a specific problem. So those are not included in this lecture. So again, I will just focus on writing a literature review for thesis and dissertations. And for those listeners who are not under me in the Graduate School of Eastern Visayas State University, I am Dr. Jeffrey Okay. I am a university professor of Eastern Visayas State University. I am also a core faculty of the graduate school. And currently, I am serving as the campus director of Eastern Visayas State University, Ormoc City campus. Before I proceed to the next slide, there are three parts of this video lecture. The first part deals with the meaning, nature, and dynamics of lit review. The second part is on the rationale behind the conduct of the literature review. And the third part is discussing the steps in doing and writing a literature review. And in doing so, I'll provide samples of one of my researches in the past. And in relation to the three parts, let me now proceed to the discussion proper. In relation to the three parts, okay, it's not working now, it's working. I have three objectives for this lecture. The first one is to define and explain the concepts of a literature review. And then the second objective is again about the rationale, and the third objective is about how to do a literature review. Now I am doing this high discussion because please be aware that, or I wish to let you know that in my style of lecture, I always incorporate the what, the why, and how in almost all of my lectures. So for example, if the topic is how to write the background of the study of a thesis, I always begin with the question of what really is the background of the study. And then second is the reason behind it. So why do we need to write the background of the study? And then the third part is on the how. So I'll explain how do we write the background of the study. So in this case, in my lecture on in this lecture, how to write the literature review, I begin with a brief discussion on the meaning of the lit review. And then the second objective, of course, talks about why and then the how. So that is why the first objective is to define and explain the concept of a literature review with emphasis on its role and significance in academic research, particularly in the context of thesis and dissertations. And then objective number two is to understand the rationale behind conducting a literature review. So again, um, after knowing the what of what we're doing, then we need to ask the why. So why we should write a literature review. And then this includes a discussion of its function in identifying a research gap or research gaps, situating the study within existing knowledge, and establishing a theoretical and conceptual framework. And then objective number three is to apply some techniques and demonstrate the ability to craft a literature review section of our thesis and dissertations. And this is supposed to align with the requirements and expectations of academic thesis and dissertations, highlighting clarity, structure, scholarly depth, and relevance to the research problem. Now, with the three objectives, let me proceed right away to the rationale behind the conduct of a literature review. I need not explain in full the objectives. I will be, of course, expanding the discussion on it later on. So what really is a literature review? So on the what of the literature review. By the way, this is very self-explanatory, especially if you are already in the graduate school, a master's or a PhD students. I'm sure you have mastered this in the undergrad when you write your thesis in the when you wrote your thesis in the undergrad. But allow me to rehash or introduce again the meaning of literature review or lit review for the sake of refreshing our knowledge on the topic. So a literature review is a comprehensive summary and critical analysis of existing research on a specific topic. In other words, a lit review identifies, evaluates, and synthesizes relevant scholarly works such as books, journal articles, and other academic sources. But more importantly, a literature review is a survey of scholarly materials that help to justify a study's relevance, refine research questions, and avoid duplication. I want to preempt or I want to expand the discussion on this a bit about justifying the study's relevance because the discussion that follows on the rationale behind the conduct of a lit review will focus more on the justifications as to why we need to conduct this research. We need to justify the timeliness, necessity, and originality of our research. And that's the main function of elite review in thesis and dissertations. You have an argument in the background of the study that the proposed research is timely and necessary and original. And then we might be asked the question, how do you know that your proposed research is timely and necessary and original? And then the answer to that is the literature review. So I'll explain that further later on. And ultimately, a lit review establishes a foundation for advancing knowledge and contributing to scholarly discourse. Again, this is very self-explanatory. So let me proceed now to objective number two. What is the rationale behind the conduct of a literature review? In other words, why the need to conduct a lit review, especially for theses and dissertations? And I have a short note here. Please note that there are countless reasons as to why the need to conduct a lit review, but let me focus on the most important ones, especially those that are directly related to thesis and dissertations. And I have three major reasons here. Let me dive right into it. So the first reason why we need to conduct a literature review again, especially for thesis and dissertation, is that a lit review contextualizes and justifies the study's problem or gap. On the one hand, in terms of context, the literature review shows what is already known and what still needs exploration in the field of specialization. And so, um, As is well known, and as we already know, we need to review the surrounding, the related, the relevant literature of our study so that again, we know the nature and that we know the deeply the nature and dynamics of the problem that we are trying to address. In other words, our research and through the lit review as well, um, we will be able to identify some gaps or problems that need further, um, addressing and things like that. And for this reason, first, the researcher can meaningfully engage in scholarly discourse in his or her field of specialization. So if we are able to provide a context of our study and master again, be familiar with the surrounding literature, the recent debates and mega trends in the fields, then again, as researchers, we can meaningfully engage in scholarly discourse in that field. So before I proceed to point number two, let me explain this further. As is well known, as scholars, as researchers, as academicians, as professors, we have annual conferences or semi-annual or a monthly or whatever. We have regular seminars and workshops and conferences in our field of specialization. For in my case, for example, I am specializing in indigenous studies and philosophy of education and critical theory. So we have regular um, um, conferences and workshops and seminars on these fields of specialization. Now we know too well that in conferences, in the actual conduct of of a conference, for example, in critical theory or indigenous studies, there is always discussions between among scholars in that field. So in my case, in critical theory, for example, or indigenous studies, because I have mastered my craft, at least the basics, of course, I have mastered the basics in critical theory and also in indigenous studies in the Philippines. I because of my readings on the lot of related literature on indigenous studies or critical theory, I can move comfortably. I can comport comfortably in that field. And that is why in conferences in critical theory, at least in the Philippines, sometimes I dominate a few of us dominate the discussion there because again, we have mastered the basics. We have read or that discipline. We have read a lot of literature in that topic so that if a young scholar engages or attends a conference or seminar and and he or she is not an expert, I should say, on the field, what will happen is that that scholar will. It happened to me when I was young, of course. They just listen to the scholars discussing in the conference or the seminars and could not contribute something meaningful to the discourse because again he or she has not uh, he or she does not have enough knowledge on the topic under investigation or under discussion. I think that's very self-explanatory, and that's one of the reasons why many young scholars, aside from the fact that they still didn't have the self-confidence not to join, only if you have the courage and the self-confidence to ask questions and engage in discussions in conferences. In addition to that, one of the reasons why they could not engage meaningfully in discourses in scholarly discourses in their field is that they lack proper or enough understanding on the context of the field of specialization. So, and so that in relation to our thesis or dissertation, especially the proposal part, so that we can write more and argue more in the background of the study or in the rationale of the study, and then we can engage more in the literature review and other parts of the thesis or dissertation. We need to read a lot of related literature again, so that we will be able to appreciate and 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 have a deeper understanding of the context of our study. Okay, so that's the importance, or the first importance of a lit review. And then second is she will be able to she for gender equality purposes, she or he will be able to show how her current study fits into and contributes to the broader field of knowledge. And allow me to explain this a bit again. We know too well that we do research not just for the sake of doing research. We do research not just for the sake of completing a master's degree or a doctoral degree. Well, that's part of the package deal, of course. But the main reason why we do research is because we saw a specific problem, for example, in the workplace or in the community, or if you're doing theoretical research, you saw a gap that needs to be filled in urgently. Mm. And so therefore, we conduct this research because we want to address a particular problem or fill a particular gap. That's one of the major functions of research. And second is, of course, we do research, especially in the theoretical part, because we want to contribute something new, something unique, something original in that particular discussion, in that particular field of specialization. So in our research, especially for young scholars, masters and PhD students, it is expected that our research, our thesis, our dissertation should contribute something new, something unique, something original to the already existing body of knowledge in that field. And we may not, or I should say, we cannot fulfill that task if we do not know the surrounding literature on that topic. Because without reviewing a lot of literature, without reviewing related literature, we might be doing some kind of duplication because at the end of the day, we realize that somebody has already done research on a topic that we are engaging at the moment. So again, therefore, the importance of lit review, especially in terms of contexts. On the other hand, in terms of justification, and I will spend enough time discussing this because this is the main and the most important points, or the most important reason, at least for me, why we do a lit review in our thesis and dissertations in terms of justification. So, in terms of justification, the lit review justifies the necessity, timeliness, and originality of our proposed study or our current study. So, I emphasize this one. I want to spend enough time discussing this, the necessity, um, timeliness, and originality of the study. Again, if we go back to our discussion on background of the study or rationale of the study for those students who were not under me in methods of research. I have another video lecture. I will provide in the description below some link to my 3 lectures on how to write the background of the study. And then I emphasize there, as if we recall, when writing the background of the study, or sometimes we call that rationale of the study, or sometimes we call that introduction, the one and the same, I should say, because in writing those part of the thesis or dissertation, there are rules to follow, and we follow the same rules, of course. Now, one of the tasks that we need to fulfill in writing the background of the study is we need to argue for the necessity and timeliness and originality of our study, of our proposed research. Because if we cannot argue, if we cannot rather establish the necessity and timeliness and originality of our study, then there's no points of conducting that research, right? So how do we determine how do we establish rather the necessity and timeliness and originality, establish and justify? It is through the lit review, of course. Hence, through the lit review, we can say that the study is necessary because there is a serious problem that needs urgent consideration. That should be that. Okay. So how do we know again that my proposed research, your proposed thesis or dissertation, um, is a necessary one? The problem that you want to see addressed is a necessary one. The argument is if there is a serious problem that needs urgent consideration. That is why, as is well known, I need not repeat this, but please allow me to reiterate this one. That is why, in any types of research, in any scholarly endeavor, research always begins with problem formulation. It always begins with gap spotting because we need to show that indeed there is an urgent problem there. There is a serious problem out there in the workplace, for example, in the community, for example, that needs urgent consideration, or there is a gap in knowledge that needs to be filled in that urgently. That's how we establish and justify the necessity of our research problem. Now, the question is, how do we exactly know that the problem is a necessary one? It's through the conduct of the lit review. I'll explain that further later on. You will understand my points. But as early as um, at this point, we know that a research problem or a research gap is a necessary one because the lit review justifies that. I'll show that later on. And then through the lit review, we can also say that the study is timely because there are several famous scholars working or publishing on this topic in the last 2 to 3 or 3 to 5 years. Okay, in terms of timeliness, and this is the reason why your advisors or panel members in thesis and dissertation defenses will always require students to cite literature in the last 2 to 3 years or in the last 3 to 5 years. Why do we need recent literature, recency? In the last 2 to 3 years, in the last 3 to 5 years, it's because first and foremost, we need to establish and justify the timeliness of our proposed research, especially the problem or gap that we want to see addressed in the paper. Of course, there are other reasons why it has to be, or the literature we cite in the paper should be in the last 2 to 3 years or 3 to 5 years. Of course, for example, in pharmacology research, I learned that in some branch or in some aspects of pharmacology in pharmacology research, they argue that, or they said that some bacteria develop immunity after 2 years. And so if a researcher, if a pharmacist or a researcher in pharmacology is doing research on that topic and the bacteria develop immunity within 2 years, then obviously when researchers, when he or she cites literature in the field, it has to be in the last 2 years. Because if it's 3 years or if it's beyond 2 years, that's no longer relevant. Because again, the idea is the bacteria have already developed immunity. You see, so there are reasons why we need to address and justify the timeliness of our literature, of our research problem. Okay. Um, and so yes, why we need to have the literature in the past 2 to 3 years or 3 to 5 years, because we want to establish and justify the timeliness of our study. That's one of the reasons why, again, our panel members in thesis and dissertation defenses require recent literature in the fields. But there are, of course, exemptions to the rule. There are always exemptions to the rule. For example, in the humanities, in his in historical research or in literature or in philosophical research. And most of the time in literature or in philosophy, we use textual analysis most of the time in as a tool in analyzing our, our text, our craft. And then, for example, if someone is doing a critique on Shakespeare's Hamlet, you know, and in that case, and and the same thing in philosophy, in that case, if the researcher is doing a critique on William Shakespeare's Hamlet, then it would be better. And for example, his or her source is, the original work of Shakespeare published in, let's say, 1610, because if I'm not mistaken, Shakespeare died in 1616, So if the literature is published in 1610, and that's the primary source of the scholar, of the researcher, then to us researchers in the humanities, in literature and philosophy, that's much better. To us, that's so valuable, because we have with us, that piece of literature published in 1610. So you can only imagine, the how nice to relish the, the moments when you have the aura, the beautiful, you enjoy the moments of having that literature, having that piece of literature published in 1610. So in that case, the timeliness, the recency of the literature will not, of course, apply. Anyway, same principle applies to philosophy. When we are doing critique on Kant's critique of pure reason, or a critique, or for example, we study, we review Hegel's phenomenology of spirit and other works that have been published 400 years, 300 years ago. It would be better if we can have that literature, with us. So in that case, the timeliness will not apply. But as a whole, in order to address the timeliness, the recency of the research, it has to be in the last 3 to 5 years, or 2 to 3 years. And then through the literature review, therefore, we can say that the study is, and this one is very important as well, original, because the topic is one of the mega trends and recent debates in the field. In as much as famous scholars have been working or publishing in this topic in the last 2 to 3 or 3 to 5 years, okay? And yet none of these scholars has done or addressed the research problem or gap that your thesis or dissertation aims to address. Okay, so in terms of, again, necessity, timeliness, and originality, it is the literature review that justifies that. So we argue in the background of the study, just to reiterate, to remind you again, we argue in the background of the study for the necessity, timeliness, and originality of the research problem, or the gap that our thesis or our dissertation or our research as a whole aims to address. But the next question there is, how do you know, in the background of the study, how do you know that your research problem is timely, is necessary, and original? The answer to that is the lit review. The lit review will establish and justify these three things. Through, again, for example, in terms of timeliness, just to reiterate, in terms of timeliness, the study, or there are several scholars working, several famous scholars working on this topic in the last 2 to 3 years, or 3 to 5 years, okay? And the necessity, through the lit review, you're able to show that indeed, after reviewing all this relevant literature, surrounding literature, I'm able to discover a gap that needs to be filled in, or a problem that needs urgent consideration. Necessary, the necessity of the problem. And then originality. Again, in terms of originality, because the topic is one of the mega trends. It's one of the mega trends and recent debates in the field. So there are many scholars working on this topic, on your proposed topic, indigenous studies, for example. And then let's say there are several famous scholars working on this topic in the last 2 to 3 years. They publish, they research and publish articles on this topic in the last 2 to 3 years, or in the last 3 to 5 years. But after knowing these things, you realize that none of these famous scholars has addressed the problem that your current research has addressed. And so therefore, our study or your study is not a duplication of what have been done in the past. It's not a duplication of what these famous scholars have done in the last 2 to 3 years or in the last 3 to 5 years. Therefore, the problem that you want to see addressed in your thesis, in your dissertation, is unique and at the same time original. Again, the question is, how do we know? There are no scholars that how again the question is, how do we know that these famous scholars on the topic did not publish on this on your problem on the research gap that you have discovered in the last 2 to 3 years? Again, the literature review justifies that, shows that. And for this reason, we can say that your thesis, again, is not duplication of what have been done in the past. Therefore, through the lit review, I'm able to justify the originality of the research problem or research gap that you want to see addressed in your current study. So that's the main reason why we need to conduct a literature review, especially in thesis and dissertation. And this is also the reason why the lit review is the second section of our thesis after the background of the study. So the background of the study on the one hand, again, the background of study is sometimes called rationale of the study or introduction. And on the other hand, the literature review. So the first section of our thesis or dissertation is the background of the study. And after writing these parts, the next section that follows should be the literature review or the review of related literature, because the two go hand in hand. You have an argument in the background of the study in terms of the necessity, originality, and timeliness of your study. The gap is the problem is indeed a researchable one, and the question is, how do you know that these are that the problem that you want to see addressed is timely, necessary, and original? The literature review will prove that. That is why, again, the two go hand in hand. After writing the background of the study, the next section that follows should be the literature review. And that is why in our debates, in one of our conferences in educational research, we argue that the lit review should not be a single chapter of our dissertation proposal or our thesis proposal. It's not a chapter. It should be part of that of chapter one, and it's part of chapter one, and it should be the second section of chapter one, and it should follow directly the background of the study, because it plays a very important role, which I have already yeah, reiterated many times. Because the study is necessary, timely, and original, through the lit review, therefore, the researcher can position herself in relation to other researchers and theorists. Let me explain this further again so that young scholars will know why the importance of this. Now going back to the idea of some groups conducting conferences, seminars, workshops. For example, in educational research, or in indigenous studies research, or in critical theory, or in philosophy of education. Look, we attend seminars regularly, and we notice that only a few are dominating the discussion. Most of the attendees simply listen. Maybe aside from the fact that maybe some of them are overcame by their um, insecurity, their fear to speak in front of a crowd, a huge crowd, maybe. That's one of the reasons, of course. But one of the major reasons why they will not, or young, especially young scholars, cannot engage well, meaningfully in the discussion, it's because we don't have, as I argued already a while ago, we have not mastered our peers. We lack mastery of the context of our problem, of our research. Okay. But based on my experience as a young scholar in the Philippines, I did my PhD in philosophy in Macquarie University in Sydney, Australia, and my research focused on critical theory. And critical theory in the Philippines is not yet famous during the time. So when I returned from Australia and there and I attended conferences in critical theory, I can contribute something meaningful and original in the discourse because my research projects in critical theory contain original or pose or offer original problems or gaps. In other words, every time I join conferences because I'm doing research in critical theory, especially critical theory at the margins, I can contribute something new in the discussion. And so that is why sometimes I'm one of those who dominate discussions in critical theory because I have the mastery of my field of specialization. I have read a lot of literature. I have reviewed a lot of literature. I have studied so many books and researches as a whole in critical theory. See? So that I have justified in my studies, in my researches in critical theory, the necessity and timeliness and originality of my research gaps, of my research problems. And I've done that. I'm able to successfully do that because I reviewed a lot of literature. I read a lot of literature in my field of specialization. So that again, if we're able to establish and justify the timeliness, necessity, and originality of our research, then, and that explains why in my case, I'm able to position myself in relation to other critical theorists in the Philippines or even abroad. I've been to Germany for my postdoc, of course, in critical theory, Institute for Social Research. I'm able to situate myself in relation to theorists in the field. And I must say, in terms of critical theory, I developed the idea of critical theory at the margins, applying the critical theory of the Frankfurt School to countries at the periphery of the global spectrum. And I'm able to do that because I read a lot of literature. I studied, the recent scholarship in my field. So again and again and again, because of that lit review, I'm able to position myself in that scholarship in critical theory. Second, show how your research addresses a gap or contributes to a debate. Yeah. That follows, of course, number one. And so because I'm able to, because through a lit review, through the literature review, I'm able to establish and justify the necessity and timeliness and originality of my proposed research or of my research or the problem of my research, then I can show the significance, the unique contribution of my research to an already existing body of knowledge in a specific discipline. And that explains why, this explains why, that rationale explains why we are too obsessed with Google Scholar, with citations in Google Scholar or citations in other, citation metrics. We are so particular with citation. Why is that when I was young, until now, I feel elated. I'm happy when somebody cites my work. That is because when somebody cites your work, according to Dr. Okay, blah, 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 that means your study is relevant. That means you have said something new to that in that in that discipline. And that the citation is one of the proofs that indeed my study contributed something unique, something significant to the already existing body of knowledge in that discipline. That's exactly why we need to do a lit review. Let me continue. So that's the first reason why the need to conduct a literature review. And I spent enough time doing that, enough time discussing that part, because to me, as I've said, that's the most important reason why we need to have the literature review section in our thesis and dissertation. The second and third reasons that I will be showing in a while are equally important, of course, but I need not dwell too much on this because these are very self-explanatory. So second, the lit review establishes the theoretical framework of the study. That's plain and simple. It's very self-explanatory. But let me just read it. As is well known, the theoretical framework serves as the foundation for understanding the concepts, relationships, and assumptions that guide the study. I don't need to explain that again. Further, it is quite clear. And in quantitative research, it helps. The literature review helps clarify key variables and informs the formulation of research questions or hypotheses. Let me just proceed to the third. And third, the lit review helps guide in identifying the appropriate methodology for the study. This is quite important. Let me explain this very briefly. Now, this is my argument. I always inform, I always inform my students in research class the importance of problem formulation. That 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 there is no research without a research problem or a research gap. And so the very first step in research, in any research endeavor, is problem formulation or gap spotting. I also have a link. I also have a video lecture on problem formulation and gap spotting. I'll provide it in the section below. Now, once we have, my point is, once we have clearly identified the problem or research problem or the gap that we want to see addressed in our paper, the argument is the research is halfway done. We just need to gather the data and process it and blah, blah, blah. And it's halfway done. It's just a matter of, you know, gathering the data and doing the other parts. Because once we have identified a problem, it sets the sail. The research problem or the research gap sets the sails of your research journey. And my point in relation to the third reason why we conduct a lit review is that once we have identified the research gap, it is the research problem or the research gap that dictates the type of methodology that we will employ in our study. So once we have the research problem, we know exactly what method to employ. However, the lit review will help us clarify this point, of course. So as I wrote here, of course, it is the research problem or research gap that dictates what methodology or what method to employ in the study, but the lit review provides additional guide. So if for fledgling scholars who have identified the research gap or the research problem, but still in doubt about as to what method to employ in the actual gathering of the data, then the literature review will provide some hint or will clarify these points. That's again the importance of the lit review. The lit review also helps the researcher decide what appropriate research design, instruments and strategies in data collection and analysis to choose. Okay, so um, with the literature review, the researchers, especially young researchers, masters and PhD students, will be guided properly in developing or in coming up with or in deciding which method to employ, which research design to employ, which instrument to use in the actual gathering of the data and things like that. I don't need to explain it further. That's very self-explanatory, especially for masters and PhD students. I'm sure you have mastered this already in during your undergraduate years. Now, before I proceed to the say the last part, the third and last part of this lecture, let us address this question. What about the idea that lit review helps identify gaps in knowledge? This is a very common notion in lit review. When you search the internet, what is the main function of the literature review? This is always the answer. That the lit review help us identify gaps in knowledge. Yes, there's no problem with that. That's exactly correct. But this is not the main intention of this lecture. And this is not the main points of a literature review in a thesis or dissertation proposal. Indeed, this is one of the functions of the lit review. However, in thesis and dissertations, once a research problem or gap has been identified, and that the rationale of the study is already written, the main function of the lit review is no longer identifying gaps in knowledge, but the 3 points just mentioned. Why? Of course, you started with problem formulation and gap spotting. And then through the techniques that I can watch the video lecture on gap spotting and problem formulation, of course, through the techniques that we use, that we employ in problem formulation or gap spotting in our research, once you have identified the problem, then you can proceed to writing the background of the study. And once we have the background of the study of our thesis or dissertation, we already have a gap in knowledge. We already have a problem that we want to see addressed in our paper. So the idea that the literature review helps identify gaps in knowledge is applicable only when you are still in the process of formulating your research problem, while you are still in the process of spotting a gap in research. And that's exactly the topic of my other lectures on gap spotting and problem formulation. So in problem formulation or gap spotting, we use literature review on how to identify those gaps in knowledge. So this is not part of the intention in this lecture, because our intention here is we already have identified a research gap. We assume that we already have identified a research gap, and then our task is to write the second section of a thesis proposal or a dissertation proposal, the lit review, in order to establish and justify the necessity, timeliness, and originality of our research gap or our research problem. So I did not include this idea because again, this is not part of the discussion. Just very briefly, again, I mentioned in the early part of this lecture that there are several types of literature review. Okay. Narrative one, the scoping one, the critical one, coming up with a publishable paper by doing some meta-analysis of huge number of literature and things like that. That is not the intention of this video lecture, just to remind you. So if you ask again, what about the idea that the lit review is the main instrument in identifying gaps. That's for problem, that's for the problem formulation or the gap spotting lecture, not in the literature review section of a thesis or dissertation. I hope that's clear. Now, on the now let me proceed to the third part of this video lecture on how to write the literature review. So, given the nature and dynamics of the literature review and the rationale behind it, the next question is, how do we properly write the literature review? Now, um, in the discussion that follows, I will be using the literature review of one of our thesis, one of my researches. Um, it's already completed. I will simply show a sample of the literature review, and then I will explain why we have come up with this kind of literature review. So, um, my I'll just very briefly discuss the steps in doing research and the steps in actually writing the literature review, and then show you some samples. Okay, but at this point, um, let me address this question. How do we write the literature review? By referring you to one of our funded research projects titled Needs Assessments of the Anti-Indigenous People in Panay Island. So I used this sample. We already submitted the manuscript of this research to a Scopus Index journal. It's not yet published. We just submitted it and it was already acknowledged by the journal. So we're still waiting for the review. And then if the journal asks us to revise some part of it, and then we will revise it and then submit again. But the point is, it's going to be published soon in a Scopus Index journal. And I am using our own research, the literature review of our research proposal, because I want to show that I have the morale, that I have the authority to talk about how to write a literature review. I want to show to my readers, to my students, that I have the authority to talk about problem formulation, to talk about how to write the methodology of a case study, and how to write the methodology parts of a phenomenological research design, on how to do a methodology parts of a correlational research design and quantitative research. Because I have done it myself. I am myself a researcher. And so if you want to know more about myself, you can just type Jeffrey Okay in Google Scholar, and then my name will appear and you will know um, I have done research on these things. So again, as to the question, how do we write the literature review? How do we properly write it? I will show an example of a thesis or a research proposal funded by the Cebu Technological University, and I have other research funded by the OST and CHED, of course, and other funding agencies. But I chose this one because this is our latest project, you know. So again, I will refer you to that, titled Needs Assessments of the Anti-Indigenous People in Panay Island. Yeah. And then what follows in the slides that follow, I will show you some samples and proofs that I'm not just talking about empty words here. I need to show to my students, to my listeners, to my viewers that we really conducted this study in a proper way. And we got 750,000 funding from Cebu Technological University for this purpose. Okay. So so this is the sample of this at this stage, this is the proposal. The research proposal is the same with the thesis, of course, of dissertation proposal. The dynamics remain the same. So as you can see, this is Cebu Technological University, CTU form, and then detailed research proposal. This is indeed a research proposal. And as you can see, the project title there is Needs Assessment of the Anti-Indigenous People in Panay Island, in islands. And then Our lead researcher in this case is Dr. Anicito Cotillas from Cebu Technological University, Argao campus. I cannot be the lead researcher in this research because the funding is coming from CTU and I am from EBSU, Eastern Visayas State University. So I can only be a member, a co-principal investigator in this research. But not to brag, I do most of the legwork in this research, and especially in the writing parts. But anyway, I'm not. Yeah, so we are three in the group. We have Dr. Anicito Cotillas, and then yours truly from Eastern Visayas State University. When we submitted this project, I was still with EBSU main, but this time I'm already in EBSU Ormo campus as because I was assigned here as campus director. And we have with us Professor John Paul Petrola, the director of the Center for Heritage and Indigenous Culture at the University of San Agustin, Iloilo. So let me briefly show you. So this is the proposal that we have. So you can see in section number 7 that we have the rationale, and then in section 8 we have the review of related literature. And then yeah, I will show this. I will show this later on. Let me just walk you through these samples to show that indeed my discussion today on how to write the literature review of thesis and dissertations is actually based on expertise. And then yeah, so we have that the objective and then the methodology part, and then yeah, data analysis part, and then the ethical consideration, and then we have the target and accomplishment and expected outputs, and then we have the Gantt chart, everything. We have everything for the research proposal, and it's signed by, of course, yeah, as you can see the our colleagues from Cebu Technological University. So with our proposal, after the proposal was approved and we get the funding, and then we conducted research. So we employ rapid ethnography in this research because this is a qualitative one, a qualitative research employing rapid ethnography as research design, and our instrument in gathering the data are interviews and observations. Of course, you know that too well. In qualitative research, the researchers are the very instrument in the actual gathering of the data, but the quanti people would always say, you have to use the word instrument. And so, yeah, we have interviews and observations. So we go to the community, of course, to the Ati community in Panay Island, in Guimaras, Dumarao, and Iloilo. And we swing by, and we have a focus group discussion with the Ati in Hamtic, Antique. We conducted it in Iloilo, and by the way, in our informed consents, our participants agree that we show them, their face, and then mention and mention their local names in our research study. So we have the informed consent. They agreed that they will be showed in social media, of course, when we post this when we posted this in Facebook. And then when we write the manuscript of the research, we mention the locale and the name. They agreed to that. So we are safe in terms of the ethical consideration of the research. So I'll be showing you some samples of some pictures as proof that we did conducted um, group interviews and focus group discussion and observations and one-on-one interview with our participants in Panay Island, the Ati people in Panay Island. So these are the yeah, so these are that's in the third yeah. So these are the we conducted the interview under the mango tree in in Jordan, Guimaras. And then yeah, that's the three of us, yours truly. Um the one in the navy blue shirt, and then in the red with in the red polo shirts, Professor John Paul Petrola of the University of San Agustin, and on the far left is Dr. Anicito Cotillas of Cebu Technological University Argao campus. And then we have these pictures, and then And then we have more. This is the Ati Community Center in Hordan, Guimaras. Okay, so we conducted another interview inside the um the how do we call this, the community center. So we had interviews in we conducted a group interview under the mango tree, and then we went to the community center, and then we interview some participants and observe how to do weaving and other things, you know. So that's us inside the community center. And in addition to the participants, we have also personnel from the Commission of National Commission for Indigenous Peoples, NCIP. Yeah. Again, the participants consented um, that they be shown in social media, and their names shall be mentioned in our manuscript. So we're fine again with the ethical consideration of the study. Okay, so that's how we do things. And then this is in Dumarao, Capiz, very mountainous area. We went there, of course, to show to you again that we conducted properly our study. And then every time we go to the community, of course, we have the attendance. There should be an attendance as proof. And then, of course, for our liquidation purposes. And then we have this, yeah. And then, yeah, still in Capiz, still in Dumarao, Capiz. And then when we went to Iloilo the following day, we are so glad that we are so lucky that the NCIP had a conference in the regional directors of the NCIP, the National Commission for Indigenous Peoples, were conducting a seminar in Iloilo City, and we learned that chairperson Jennifer Sibuglas was there. So we swung by the venue of the conference, and had the picture of the chairperson of the NCIP. um she is equivalent to Chair Popoy of CHED, so she is very powerful. She's a very powerful person in the commission, in the NCIP, the National Commission for Indigenous People. So we're showing with you that we are indeed doing the right thing in this research. And of course, again, the intention to show that I have published a lot in this field of specialization. I'm showing with you that what I will be sharing shortly in terms of preparing the literature review is indeed based on expertise and authority. And then this is in Iloilo, in Lanit, Iloilo. We conducted another interview for the ATI in the Iloilo city. We are we have another research in Iloilo titled Daily Experience of Injustice Among ATI in Iloilo City. So the topic is discrimination, and this interview is intended for discrimination. At the same time, of course, the needs of the ATI people. Okay, so that's the last picture. So after showing you the proof that we did conducted research studies, I don't have enough time to share with you just the transcription, and then the thematic analysis that we do and things like that. So after this, I will just show with you the parts, a screenshot of our manuscript that is submitted for publication in an index, as in a Scopus Index journal. So this is the first part. So the working title again is Needs Assessment of the Anti-Indigenous People in Panay Island. But when we are done with the research, we came up with a beautiful, I should say, beautiful title. The title is now Unveiling the Aspirations of the Ati People in Panay Island, a transformative needs assessment. Okay, So again, in my other lectures, in research, I explained there that the reason why we call that working title, it's because that title will simply guide us in the conduct of the study. But once we are done with our research, that will definitely change. Not definitely, that may change depending on the context. So in our case, of course, we always think for the better, and we decided. I think this is the most appropriate title of the study. Need unveiling the aspirations of the Ati people in Panay Island and transformative needs assessments. And again, there are the three of us there: Anesito Cotillas, John Paul Petrola, and yours truly. And then let me just that's the first part. We show you the abstract of the study to show you again that indeed we are done with the paper, and then after the abstract, you have the parts, and then the research design and instrument, the methodology part, and then see the data analysis part, and then the results and discussion, just some samples of the results and discussion, and the conclusion and the recommendation. Yeah. So it's really a completed project. Now, let me now proceed to the last part of um, the lecture on the steps in doing the literature review, and then the last two major part, the last two sections of the last third and last major part of this lecture: steps in doing the lit review, and the second is steps in writing the lit review. Now, let me just walk you through this, because I know this is very self-explanatory. You have done this already in the past. You know exactly the reason behind that and things like that. So I will just read, yeah, these parts, and do some side discussion if necessary. But most of the time, this is self-explanatory. I'll just read this part. Okay, so the steps in doing the literature review, this is very basic. You know this tool again. The first step is defining the research topic or question. Okay, so uh, and then being clear about the scope and focus, as well as what the researcher tries to understand, prove, or explore. It's not the question mark there is not part of the it's supposed to be a full stop, not question mark. But anyway, and then step two, searching for relevant literature. Obviously, you have to search for the relevant literature. That is why, again, it's very self-explanatory. And then yeah, using databases like Google Scholar, JSTOR, PubMed, Scopus, and the like. These are the sources of literature aside from books, of course. So we use databases. Very self-explanatory again. Just as number one, defining the research topic or question, you should have a research problem, you should have a research aim, you know exactly what to do and what to explore, what to understand. And then before you go to the library or to the internet and things like that, you have that idea. And then, of course, you search the relevant literature using databases like Google Scholar, JSON, PubMed, Scopus, and the like. Very self-explanatory. No need for further explanation. And of course, this includes books and journal articles, reports, theses, and credible online sources. And then step three, evaluating and selecting sources. There's no need again for me to explain it further. Very self-explanatory. This involves prioritizing peer-reviewed and high-quality sources. I'm sure your professor in methods of research or in introduction to research or any introductory course to research explained this already. And I'm sure if you are a master or a PhD student, you have mastered this part already. And then this also involves assessing relevance, credibility, methodology, and findings. And then step four involves organizing the literature, you know that so well. And then this involves grouping studies by themes, trends, methods, chronology, or theoretical approaches. By the way, let me do a bit of side discussion on this. The idea of grouping studies by themes, trends, methods, chronology, or theoretical approaches. It doesn't mean that in your lit review you have to include all of them. Okay, so you have to have the theme, that you have to have the trend, that you have to have a group for the methods and chronology, all of them. No, that depends on the attack that you use in writing your lit review. So if my style is to justify, is to prove that indeed my study is timely and necessary, then I may just talk about some theoretical approaches in doing that, without talking about chronology, without talking about the methodology. So in organizing your literature, you may use one or combine two of this, say themes and trends, or maybe trends and chronology. That depends on the nature of your study and the intention and your way of writing the literature review. So this is up for grab. It's for you to decide what to use. If you want to use all of them, to employ all of them, the themes, trends, and other theoretical approaches and things like that in organizing your literature, go ahead. There's no rules that block you from doing that. But again, the point is you don't need to include all of them. And then you're creating, and this also includes creating a matrix or table to track key ideas, authors, and arguments. That still depends on your style. You don't need to explain that further. And then step 5, identifying gaps, contradictions, and trends, which involves highlighting what has been studied, what remains unexplored, where do studies agree or disagree. And in relation to my discussion a while ago, um, identifying gaps is not the main concern in this research, but of course that's part of the steps in conducting a lit review. Yeah. And then steps in writing the lit review. So after the steps in doing a lit review, and after walking you through the steps in writing the lit review, doing and writing, steps in writing, and after this, I will show a sample of our research, and I will read them and then explain if I needed to. So because my argument is, once we know the steps and then the rationale behind doing the lit review, and then we have the sample based on a concrete research, completed research, and then while presenting that, explaining it further, I'm sure you will be able to. I'm sure you will be guided properly. Okay, so anyway, on the steps in writing the lit review, step 1, writing the introduction. So just like writing the background of the study, still writing the literature review follows the sitting card. You have the heads, the body, and the tail. You have the introduction, the body, and the conclusion. So the step 1 in writing the literature review, is writing the introduction. This involves defining the topic and its significance, and then outlining the scope of the review, and then stating your organizational structure or criteria for selection. By the way, the points below are simply suggestions. Some of the ideas, some of the some of the suggestions that will guide you in writing your own lit review. You don't have to have all of the three. Again, just like the previous discussion on themes on organizing the lit review, you don't have to have all these 3 points. You can have one, you can have two, you can have three, you can have four, or you can develop your own style. But this is how I do it myself. Okay. So this is just a guide. There's no one size fits all rule in writing the introduction. And then we have step 2, writing the body. There are 3 steps in writing the literature review, of course: introduction, body, and the conclusion. In writing the body, this includes organizing themes, or this organized by themes, or organizing themes, chronology, or methodology, depending on your topic again. So again, I reiterate that one. When you synthesize and analyze the body of your literature review, it could be viewed, or it could be attacked from the vantage points of chronology, methodology, themes. Depends. You can be argumentative in your literature review. Again, that depends on your topic, and that depends on what you really intend to do. If it's indeed for research proposal, for a thesis proposal, for dissertation proposal, that depends. But at least we have a guide here. Okay. And then it is in the body of your lit review that you summarize and synthesize key findings as well. And then you compare and contrast different perspectives. You compare that. Study one, Scholar one says this, but Scholar two says this, and things like that. So you may also do that, and then pointing out gaps, inconsistencies, and debates. So these are just some ideas, suggestions that guide you in writing the body of your literature, of your related literature. Okay? You may use all of them. You may attack um, the writing of your lit review by just using the two of them, or you come up with your own. That depends. Again and again and again, this simply serves as a guide in writing the lit review. And then in step three, um, writing the conclusion. So that's our style of writing. My style of writing. I've been trained in Macquarie University to do this way. Start with an introduction, and then you develop it in the body, you conclude, or in other words, you close the discussion or you conclude before proceeding to the next one. Okay. And this involves summarizing the main insights gained in the body of the lit review, and then suggesting how your own research will contribute, in the already existing body of knowledge, and then rehashing the fact that the study is indeed timely, necessary, and original. Okay, so these are the main points, the major steps in writing the lit review. You will understand me when I show you the sample later on. That is why it's very hard to talk about writing the literature review without a concrete example, because yeah, it's still not confusing, but it's still at this point, it's not yet thoroughly presented. Anyway, so when writing these are the steps in writing the lit review. When writing the lit review, of course, as I mentioned, we need to have the idea of a sitting cat. So the same principle, the same technique that we employ in writing the background of the study, still on the sitting cat. We need to have the structure, the introduction of your lit review, the body of your lit review, and the conclusion of your lit review. And the introduction, of course, serves as the opening, that sets the stage for the review, whose primary goal is to provide the reader with a clear understanding of the topic, the context, and the rationale for reviewing the existing literature review. So you have to have an introductory part. And then the body contains the synthesis and analysis of the literature and the review. It also provides a comprehensive overview of this literature, which includes the findings, debates, methodologies, and the like. Again, depending on your attack, depending on your style of writing, depending on the context. And then you have the conclusion. And this normally wraps up the discussion in the body by summarizing its key insights. So by following, okay, so in the next slides, I'll be showing the sample of our lit review. I will read them, but I will show you that it's the same with, when writing the lit review, I have in mind the sitting cat, the introduction, the body, and the tail. Let me show you the sample. So we have this sample, for example, the, the lit review that I'm showing you at this point is, how I should say this, is quite short, because this is a lit review of a research proposal. And as you can see, there's a note there not to exceed 3 pages. So we have to be economical in writing our lit review. So this is quite short, but for thesis and dissertation, that's quite long, of course. Maybe your advisor or the panel requires you to write for a master's thesis at least 20, sources, 20 literatures, and then for the PhD at least 30, and things like that. That depends. So it's quite long. But the point is, whether it's a short literature review like this one, or a long literature review of a thesis and dissertation, the process and the principle remain the same. Okay, so this is our the sample that I will share here. with you. So this is the body of the cuts. This is the introductory parts of our literature review. So as you can see, when writing our literature review, we do not just write this out of in a vacuum. We just say anything we wish to say. My point is, when writing the lit review, just like any other section of the proposal of the thesis or the dissertation, everything is planned according to the rules of thumb in writing them. So in this case, I had the plan, which is the seating cut. And the plan is to write the introductory parts of the lit review, the first step. And then after that, I will write the body, the second step, and then I will conclude the third step. That's it. The content, I will read it later on. So this is the body of the cut, or the introductory part of our lit review, and this is the body. This forms parts of the body of the lit review. This forms part of the body of the lit review as well. This forms part of the body as well. This forms part of the body as well. Okay. And then since again our this is a grant proposal, this is a grant proposal, so our lit review is limited to not to exceed 3 pages, so we have to be very economical. So I already have 2 pages, and that's fine because that's the requirement, the guideline. And then after that, we conclude. That's the tail of the cut. Okay. So and then let me proceed. So as you can see, this is the body of the cat. And then as you can see, eh, explains what and because remember the title of this proposal is Needs Assessment of the Ati Indigenous People in Panay Island. So part of the introduction is the explanation of what a needs assessment is and its importance. I don't need to go back to the steps, but I think you can play it back if you want to. But the point is I explain this parts in the steps in writing the lit review. Okay, so in these 3 paragraphs, in this introductory part of the lit review, I explain what a needs assessment is and its importance. And then I also define the scope and its significance. And then I also mentioned several related studies. By the way, you may not, some of my colleagues in EBSO ask our students to drop the narration of some of the samples of the literature that we will review in the paper. Well, there's no rules. There is no rule that prevent them from doing that. If the panel decided that we have to remove that part, then we can remove this part. But if we narrate some of the important literature that we will review in the study, which is directly related to the topic that we're doing, that's fine as well. There's no rule that blocks us, that hamstrings us from doing that. Okay, so in this case, I mentioned the several related studies that related to my study, of course, that I review here. And then, as you can see also, I will read this later on, of course, the introductory parts argues for the need to do needs assessment of the Ati people. That's the introductory parts. And I'm now breaking down the parts so that you will understand at least, the basics in doing this. And then we have the body, parts of the body. And as is well known, as I already explained, this includes the summary and synthesis of the findings. And here I showed what they missed, what these scholars missed to do vis-a-vis our current study. So in other words, we now situate our study in this discourse, in this body of knowledge, in this field of specialization, in this scholarship. And then we have the conclusion. Here, we summarize the main insights gained from the body of the lit review. And then we rehash the fact that we mention again the fact that Our study, needs assessment of the Ati people in Panay Island, is indeed timely, necessary, and original. So that's how we convince the funding agency that our proposed research, proposed because it was still a proposal by during the time, that our proposed research deserve a 750,000 budget and should be funded because it is a necessary research because it addresses a serious problem that needs urgent consideration. It is timely because there are a lot of scholars, famous scholars working on this field in the last 2 to 3 years or in the last 3 to 5 years. And it is an original work because despite the scholars, the number of famous scholars working in these fields, none of them address, the needs of the Ati people in Panay Island. Therefore, the originality and uniqueness of our study. And so we're able to secure the funding. We're able to convince the funding agency that again, this is a very important research because it's timely, necessary, and original. And so you have to rehash that parts and so the point is, we're able to establish and justify the necessity, timeliness, and originality because of the lit review, which is the second part of which is the section that follows the rationale of the study. And then we have to rehash that points in the concluding part because we have to remind our panel that indeed, this is important. Yeah. So, with that, let me read the entire two-page because small page. Well, anyway, let me now read the literature review of our study. I'll read the entire literature review. So let me start with the introduction. Okay. A needs assessment is an important process that helps identify the needs and priorities of a specific population or community. In the case of the Ati indigenous people of Panay Island, Philippines, some of the country's most marginalized and underserved population, a needs assessment can provide valuable importance to guide the development of programs and interventions that address the community's unique needs. So again, these two sentences, I'm able to address what a needs assessment is, how important it is, especially in the indigenous people, the Ati indigenous people in Panay Island. Then I proceed. Several studies have already highlighted the importance of understanding the nature and dynamics of the Ati communities in Panay Island, as well as the challenges that these communities face in the midst of globalization. Some of these studies include, so in this case, I have to defend our case. I need to cite this literature, these studies, because I want to prove to my readers that indeed there are several famous scholars working on it. That's the rationale behind that, why we need to narrate this title. But again, if your panel asks you to drop this one, then you have to obey because we're in a democratic society and the majority must prevail. And the panel is the majority, so what can we do? But anyway, you may justify your case. Okay. So some of these studies includes uh, ni Lil Gavinos Ati, the indigenous people of Panay, their journey and social birthright and loss. Then we have Karabi, Baruas, a forgotten people, the Ati community of Aklan. Ronela S. Hondos and Eva T. Aldons Ati of Nagpana, Barutak Viejo, West Central Philippines. Ethnic identity issues and challenges. And Leo Andrew B. Biklar and others, knowledge, attitude, and practices on environments of the indigenous people in Capiz, Philippines. So before I read the next sentence, please know that is why we call this review of related literature. As you notice, all of the literature there are about the Ati people in Panay Island. So we have to review all the surrounding studies on these indigenous people in the island. So I do not talk about any other studies. So because I noticed not in one, in some studies in the graduate school, of course, of Eastern Visayas State University, when the student is not guided properly in writing the lit review, um, the researcher simply cite a lot of literature that are not directly related to the study. So we drop that one. So we make sure that the the studies that we are citing must be about the topic that we are studying. And of course, just some hint in conducting the study. When choosing when choosing the literature, we do not just choose it because um, it's available out there. But we have to be very careful because some of the study are not, some of the scholars are not yet established, are not yet in the authority to talk about this, you know. So we have to be very selective when citing this literature. So we have to review again. We have to that is why lately we have, of course, ResearchGate, we have Google Scholar, we have LinkedIn and other platforms for scholars to post their credibility to their credentials so that to establish their credibility and authority because to us established scholars we do not just simply we do not easily cite scholars in our study. We have to make sure that that scholar is indeed, you know, an authority in the field, and that the study the paper is not published in a predatory journal. There are some criteria to follow, like as much as possible the paper must be published in a peer-reviewed journal, or at least in ACI index journal. ACI is no longer existing, it's already defunct, but anyway, Scopus index journal and things like that. So at the end of it all, the point is we need to make sure that the literature that we cite is reliable and is directly related to our study. Okay, that is why we mention it. Anyway, let me proceed. But one particular study that this proposed research heavily banks on is the work of John Paul Petrola and other titles, The Wheel of Self-Determination, The Will to Self-Determination, Understanding the Life of the Ati People in Aklan, Philippines. Yeah. But anyway, as you can see, another technique, another style in writing scholarly paper in general is that try to be as conversational as possible. Okay, try to be as conversational and narrative as possible. It's like you're talking to your reader, you know. Anyway, let me just continue. Still in the introductory parts. Now, the last paragraph in the introductory parts. So we said despite the existence of this important reason, important, you see, important. So the use of important there is planned because we want to show to our readers that the literature that we are citing is not simply pocho pocho, it's not simply wishy-washy work, but one that is produced by established scholars in the field, you know. That is why we say importance. Again, despite the existence of this important recent literatures, plural literatures, combination of literature, of course, on the other indigenous people in Panay, the researchers argue that they miss to highlight the specificity of the needs of the Ati people themselves. See, we conduct the lit review, we situate our own study. So there are already existing scholarship on this topic. Several famous scholars on Ati people have done research on this and published papers on this topic. And so we can say that indeed they are one of the mega trends of recent debates in the field, of course. But our intention here is we review those literature because we want to situate our own projects, because we want to show that ours is indeed, in addition to being necessary and timely, we want to show to our readers that indeed our study is original, because unique and original, because it's not a duplication, it's not a repeat of what these famous scholars had done in the past. Okay? So again, that is why we say, despite the existence of this important recent literatures on the anti-indigenous peoples in Panay, the researchers argue that these famous scholars missed to highlight the specificity of the needs of the Ati people themselves. Hence, what makes this proposed research unique and different from these literatures is the fact that it assesses the needs of the Ati people by letting these indigenous people speak for themselves. Here, The researcher will not only give the artists the chance to express their sentiments and lay down their deep-seated claims, so to speak, but also provide them with a proper platform for these sentiments and deep-seated claims to be heard by the proper authority, most particularly the National Commission on Indigenous Peoples and the Philippine government as a whole. Hence, the researchers argue in the end that the identification, cataloging, analyzing, and assessment of the needs of the indigenous peoples in Panay, that is, that this proposed research aims to do, will surely contribute in improving the overall health and well-being of the artists themselves. And then we say, the literature review that follows will prove this point. So you think of how when we write these parts, we do not just um, we do not just write it according to our whims and caprice and just write them randomly. No, it's planned. So as you can see, it's planned. That's it. You have it there. You have the introduction and the body and the conclusion. And we have argued, we have a solid argument in the introduction why we want to conduct this study. We have a solid proof in claiming that the study is unique and original. Again, because these famous scholars have not addressed, these famous scholars working on the same topic, Ati people, have not addressed the needs of the Ati people. That's what makes our research unique and original, in addition to being timely and necessary. Okay? So let me go back again, proceed to the introduction. So that's the introduction again. Let me now proceed to the body of, okay. And so if you notice, the last sentence of the introductory parts of the literature review, it reads, the literature review that follows will prove this point. So that sentence is provides a transition from the introduction to the body. So as you can see, if you add that sentence, it will not appear abrupt. Like the way our thesis and dissertations, even PhD students, when writing their thesis, it's like when they write their thesis, the background of the study, or the literature review, it's like they're just getting one idea from here and another idea from here and another idea from there, and then they combine that, and that's their thesis, and that's their background of the study, their literature review. But it has to be planned. You have to have the notes. You should have notes. You should have read articles. You should have thought about it. And then you write your paper in a logical, coherent manner. And in doing so, you need to have connectives to establish the connection from point A to point B to point C to point D, and so on and so forth. So the last sentence, after arguing in the introduction that, look, it's timely and necessary and original and blah, 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 therefore this research is very important, and so on and so forth. And then after doing the introductory parts, then I have the sentence. We have the sentence. The literature review that follows will prove these points. Because we are now sending a signal to our readers that we are now moving to the next part. Because when you read the literature review, you can only, we don't put a subsection there, introduction, body, and conclusion. Now we just write lit review. But if you are an expert, or if you have mastered the basics in research writing, you know exactly that the writing is, there is the sitting cat there, that there is the body of the cats, there's the head of the cats, and the body of the cats, and the tail of the cats. Okay, so this is the body of the cats. We are now moving, this is the head of the cat, rather, the introductory parts. We are now moving to the body, and that's the next parts. Okay, so, and then let me read this one to give you an idea about the contents of the review of each article. The point here again is You may or may not include all the concepts that we need to put in the body, like themes, chronology, methodology, and theoretical approaches and things like that. Those are just guides. Okay, you can have your own style as long as it follows still the proper way of doing it. So that you need to, show that at the end of the day, this is what they're doing. These are the debates in the field and things and so on and so forth. Again, that depends on your style. That depends on the context, of course. But this is how we do our parts. This is how we do the lit review, the body of our lit review based on the need of our research. Okay, let me continue. First of all, Gavino's Ati, the indigenous people of Panay, their journey, ancestral birthright, and loss, investigates not only the history of the Atis in Panay, but also their current economic status, ancestral rights, development issues, challenges. More importantly, Gavino's study zeroed in on a comparative study between the displacement of the Ati as marginalized minorities and how they have been portrayed and celebrated in dance festivals, such as the Dinagyang Festival. Gavino concludes that the celebration and portrayal of the Atis in dance festival can sometimes be a form of mockery. But Gavino is quick to add that for these dance festivals to be considered a form of paying homage to the artists in the island, then these dance festivals must include the rightful representation and use its funds for the preservation of the Ati people of Panay. Let me continue. As we can see, I'm engaging Gavino's paper or work. As we can see, Gavino's study deserves due recognition as it clearly addresses some of the issues that surround the Adi communities in Panay. However, okay, see, we engage. I provided, we rather, because we're three in the study, we provided an overview, a summary of the key points, the key concepts of Gavino's study. And then we acknowledge his contribution here. However, after acknowledging it, we pinpoint some soft spots or gap where we can situate our own study. I hope you notice that here. Again, it reads, as we can see, Gavino's study deserves due recognition as it clearly addresses some of the issues that surround the Ati communities in Panay. However, it does not directly deal with the specificity of the needs of the Ati themselves. Well, Gavino's a paper, well, Gavino says that, we have to, in a way, that's just a typo there. Well, Gavino says that her paper investigates the economic status of the Atis. This discussion, uh, um, this discussion of this issue remains underdeveloped in the paper. Hence, again, the uniqueness of our proposed research. So, aside from the fact that we briefly reviewed narrative, the attack or the style that we use in writing this review of Gavino's paper is narrative, but we also it's also argumentative at the same time, and we engage in a little bit of debate. So we say Gavino's paper is nice, blah blah blah, and it should be recognized for its contribution in terms of cultural preservation, blah blah. However, Gavino missed to highlight the specificity of the needs of the Ati people, and so therefore our study, the study of Dr. Cotillas, Dr. Okay, and Professor John Paul Petrola is different from Gavino's. So therefore, our study is not a duplication of what Gavino has already done. Okay. And then we proceed to the next article, and then we review it, and then again show that our study is different from Barua's. Okay. So before I proceed again, another angle, just to reiterate the argument that in writing the lit review of a thesis, we have to be reminded of the three key concepts: necessity, timeliness, and originality. And I think we have addressed the necessity already and timeliness because there are a lot of scholars working in the field, and in the last 10 years, 5 years, But the third is originality. How do we know that my study is unique and original? This famous scholars has not done it yet. That's our main intention here. We review the work and show that they have not addressed what we're supposed to address. At the end of the day, we will be able to show that our study is unique and original because Gavino, Barua, and all of the famous scholars in Ati indigenous peoples have not rather addressed what our proposed research aims to address. See, there's a reason behind that. So I hope you understand that point because I have explained that when I discussed the rationale behind writing a literature. So let me continue. Karabi Barua's A Forgotten People, the Ati community of Aklan, also emphasized the need for a comprehensive needs assessment that considers the Ati's cultural, economic, social, and environmental factors. We are almost the same. Barua talks about needs of the Ati. But let me continue. Barua's study suggests that a needs assessment can provide valuable information to inform policies and programs that address the community's needs. While Barua's ambitions, while Barua's ambitious study engages the concrete problems that the artists are facing lately, such as landlessness, lack of political representation and participation, education backwardness, preservation of cultural and linguistic identity, and health, it appears that the articulation of the said problem does not directly come from the mouth of the artists themselves. So that's one of the lacunas of one of the weaknesses of Barua's idea, because those needs are simply coming from the thoughts of Barua, not from the Ati themselves, the Ati indigenous people speaking their minds in terms of their needs. Okay. So, in other words, Barua's study did not consult the artists themselves as well as the organizations and stakeholders that directly serve and work with the artists. Hence, one may suspect whether the said problems are really coming from the arty or the artists or the arty people or the artists themselves. There is therefore a need to conduct a thorough assessment of the needs of the Ati indigenous people in Panay that involves a direct consultation with the artists themselves and the organizations and stakeholders that serve and work directly with the artists. One that this proposed research aims to achieve. See, we reviewed Barua's paper, research, and we acknowledge its contribution again, of course, but we have pinpointed some weakness there, or not necessarily weakness, aspect that the study means to address. And that's where we situate again our proposed study, titled Needs Assessment of Dati Indigenous People in Panay Island. Before I proceed, I hope you can see now how we write the literature review, that it's not just a random narration of statements that we gather, that we lift from sources, from the internet, from books, from journals. The way we write the literature review involves thinking, involves reading the piece of literature, of that related literature, summarize it, understand it, and try to think of how you will attack the writing of the lit review in this case. So the review of Barua's paper in this case appears to be just one paragraph, small paragraph, but it is very concise and it hits the point. Because when I say a while ago, it depends on the context. In this case, the context is we situate the urgency, the necessity, and originality of our research. And how we do that? We show that this is what these famous scholars did. And this is what they missed. That's why and where we situate our proposed research. Please don't forget that one. It's very important. Let me proceed. Proceed to another scholar. Leo Andrew P. Biclar and others' knowledge, attitude, and practices on environments of the indigenous peoples in Capiz, Philippines, documented the knowledge, attitude, and practices on environments of the indigenous people in Capiz. But in addition to this goal, Biclar and others' study emphasized the need for a comprehensive needs assessment that considers the artist's cultural, economic, social, and environmental factors. Still, they talk about the importance of knowing about the needs of the Ati people. The study suggests that it can provide valuable information to inform policies and programs that address the community's needs. The researchers are convinced that and Biklar et al.'s suggestion deserves urgent consideration and that it will definitely contribute in addressing the needs of the artists. Indeed, this is one of the reasons why this research is proposed. So Biklar and Barua argued for the needs assessments and yes, and in this point, yeah, we said okay, Biklar said that and the Biklar suggests that Biklar and others suggest for the conduct of the needs assessment. So you see, in this case, we do not just say because it's very clear that Biklar and the team did not conduct the needs assessment. They just say there's a need to do that in the recommendation of the study, and so our proposed research, which aims to document the needs of the Ati people to assess the needs of the Ati people in Panay Island is really based on the recommendation of a previous study. Thus, we include that in the literature review. Uh, And then lastly, um, Petrola and others, the will to self-determination, understanding the life of the Ati people in Aklan found out that the artists in Aklan have been suffering from marginalization brought about by the intrusion and penetration of globalization into their communities. Petrola and others said that some of the concrete proofs of this marginalization are land grabbing and militarization. Petrola and others argued that these forms of marginalization have directly contributed to the continued popularization of the artists in Aklan. In addition to the researchers' position that the artists struggle for recognition, deserve due recognition, Petrola and others or et al also argue that there is an urgent need to conduct a needs assessment of the artists, not just in Aklan but in Panay Island. Petrola and others are convinced that these needs assessments will definitely contribute in addressing the problems that the artists in Panay have been facing for the longest period of time. Again, it is for this reason that this research is proposed. So, as you can see, we plan the writing of the body of the literature in this case. The first two conducted a very important study on the Ati people, but they missed to address the needs. They missed to address the needs, of the Ati people by conducting an actual assessment of the needs, and so therefore the uniqueness and originality of our research of our proposed research was justified. And then there are two scholars as well saying that after the conduct of their study, as part of the recommendation, said that there is a need to conduct a needs assessment of the Ati people in Panay Island. So with that, we're able to argue and situate again the uniqueness and originality and urgency and timeliness of our research, of course. And then lastly, let me now proceed to the concluding parts. So again, with the idea of the sitting cat's body, the sitting cat head, body, and tail, we have to close our discussion. And this is very simple, of course, but many scholars, even I notice even some established or older scholars miss this part. So we have to close again the discussion before we proceed to the other section. So in this case, going back to the discussion a while ago on step three of writing the literature review, the conclusion part here, we have to wrap up the discussion and then rehash the argument, restate the arguments that indeed the proposed research or the current study is timely, necessary, and original. Okay. The conclusion reads, As we can see, the existing literature on the anti-indigenous people, or as we can see, the existing literature on the anti-indigenous communities of Panay Island underscores their historical marginalization and the urgent need for tailored interventions. While studies by Gavino, Barua, Biclar, and others, and Petrola and others offer valuable insights into the artist's sociocultural and environmental struggles, they fall short in capturing the community's needs from the artist's own perspective. This research addresses that gap by conducting this proposed research, our study. Our study addresses that gap by conducting a participatory needs assessments, enabling the artist to voice their concerns directly. By centering indigenous voices, our study this study contributes original data to guide policy and program development for the artist's well-being and self-determination. That's it. So much for the discussion on how to write a literature review. This I'm just sharing a very basic idea on how to write the lit review for thesis and dissertations. And if there are questions and comments in the comment section below. I will address them. Maybe I'll provide another video lecture on that. But at this point, I hope you have some ideas now on how to write properly our review of related literature. And I hope it guides you in writing your um, literature review of your thesis or dissertation proposal, or even your thesis when you're done with it, when you're or even your research when you your grant proposal and other um, scholarly work that requires a literature review. So that's all from now from my end at this point. Thank you very much, and I wish you all the best in your studies. God bless.